If a kingdom can walk past a crying child, then perhaps the kingdom has forgotten what strength truly means. The crowded royal marketplace fell into complete silence as Alpha King Ethan Montgomery gently lifted a small, crying Omega girl into his arms, holding her with the quiet certainty of a father who had finally found the child he had been searching for all along. Hundreds of people stood frozen beneath colorful merchant banners and bright afternoon sunlight, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Moments earlier, the same little girl had sat alone on the cold stone pavement while countless strangers hurried around her without slowing their steps. Some had glanced at her with pity before looking away. Others had pretended not to hear her soft sobs at all. Yet now the most powerful man in the kingdom stood in the very center of the square, his royal cloak moving gently in the breeze as he wrapped it around the trembling child to keep her warm. The little girl, Lily Harper, no more than 8 years old, clutched a worn cloth doll against her chest as tears continued rolling down her pale cheeks. She looked up at the tall man holding her with frightened blue eyes, unable to understand why someone she had never met treated her as though she mattered. Ethan looked back at her with calm kindness instead of sympathy. There was no trace of embarrassment in his expression, no hesitation, and certainly no concern for the whispers spreading rapidly through the crowd. He simply adjusted the cloak around her small shoulders before speaking in a steady voice that carried across the entire marketplace. No child should ever believe that crying alone is normal. His words settled over the gathering like a promise. Several royal guards arrived only seconds later, pushing carefully through the crowd before stopping in complete surprise. The captain immediately lowered himself onto one knee, followed by every guard behind him. Gasps echoed from every direction as merchants, travelers, craftsmen, and noble visitors suddenly realized the traveler they had barely noticed all morning was their Alpha King. One by one, people followed the guards, bowing their heads in respect, but Ethan paid little attention to them. His focus remained entirely on the frightened little girl resting safely in his arms. Lily instinctively held onto the front of his cloak, as though afraid this unexpected kindness might disappear if she let go. Ethan gently brushed a loose strand of blonde hair away from her face and offered a reassuring smile that carried none of the distance expected from a ruler. "You are safe now," he said quietly. "No one will ask you to face this world alone again." The marketplace remained completely silent. Even those who had ignored Lily only moments before now struggled to meet the king's eyes. They had expected a royal speech about law or order. Instead, they witnessed compassion becoming stronger than authority. Ethan slowly turned toward the gathered crowd, his voice remaining calm but impossible to ignore. "Today this child returns with me to the palace, not because she has earned kindness, but because kindness should never have been withheld from her in the first place." As Lily rested her head against his shoulder for the first time in what felt like forever, she did not yet know that this single moment would forever divide her life into two parts: the years before someone chose to see her, and everything that came after. 24 hours earlier, before the marketplace had fallen silent, and before anyone knew a single act of compassion would change the future of a forgotten child, Lily Harper woke beneath the covered porch of an abandoned bakery at the edge of the royal square. The morning air was cool, and she wrapped her thin brown blanket a little tighter around her small shoulders while holding the worn cloth doll that had once belonged to her mother. At only 8 years old, the white-skinned Omega girl had already learned that crowded places could be the loneliest places in the kingdom. As merchants opened colorful stalls filled with fresh bread, fruit, fabrics, and flowers, families filled the streets with cheerful conversation, yet no one noticed the little girl quietly brushing dust from her dress before searching for a place where she would not be in anyone's way. She found a small stone fountain near the center of the square and sat beside it, hoping someone might offer a smile or simply ask whether she was all right. Hours passed while hundreds of footsteps crossed the marketplace. Some people looked at her for only a moment before continuing with their busy lives. Others gently pulled their own children closer whenever they noticed the small Omega girl sitting alone. Lily never complained. She simply lowered her eyes and hugged her doll more tightly each time another family walked away. Around noon, her stomach growled softly as the wonderful smell of fresh bread drifted through the square. She counted the 2 small copper coins hidden inside her pocket, realizing they were not enough to buy even the smallest loaf. Instead, she walked toward a public drinking fountain and quietly filled a small wooden cup with cool water, pretending that it was enough to satisfy her hunger. A kind elderly baker noticed her from across the street and almost stepped forward with a warm roll in his hands, but another customer called for assistance, and the opportunity quietly slipped away. Lily returned to the fountain, carefully smoothing the faded dress her mother had sewn before illness had taken both of her parents. She remembered her father's gentle voice telling her that kindness always mattered, even when the world seemed too busy to notice it. She tried to believe those words, but every passing hour made them feel harder to hold on to. As afternoon sunlight stretched across the stone streets, the marketplace became even busier. Laughter echoed between the buildings while musicians played cheerful melodies nearby, yet the little girl seemed invisible among the celebration. Eventually, tears filled her blue eyes despite her best effort to remain brave. She buried her face against the old cloth doll, hoping no one would notice her crying because she had already learned that tears often made people uncomfortable instead of compassionate. One by one, strangers continued walking past without stopping. Lily wondered if perhaps she had become so small that the entire kingdom could no longer see her. At that very moment, a tall traveler wearing a weathered cloak quietly entered the marketplace from the northern road, carrying himself with calm confidence while observing every face around him. Unlike everyone else, he did not hurry toward the busy shops or crowded streets. His attention settled on one lonely child sitting beside the fountain, and without knowing it, Lily Harper was only moments away from meeting the one person who would finally choose to stop walking. The traveler slowed his steps as he approached the small stone fountain, his attention fixed not on the crowded marketplace, but on the little girl sitting alone with tears quietly slipping down her cheeks. Lily Harper immediately wiped her face with the sleeve of her faded dress, hoping the stranger would continue walking like everyone else had. Instead, he gently lowered himself onto the edge of the fountain several feet away, careful not to frighten her. For a few peaceful moments, he said nothing at all. The lively sounds of merchants advertising fresh fruit, musicians playing cheerful melodies, and children laughing around the square continued in the background, yet an unexpected feeling of calm settled over the quiet space between them. After a moment, the traveler reached into his worn leather satchel and removed a small loaf of fresh bread wrapped in clean cloth along with a bright red apple. He placed them carefully beside Lily instead of handing them directly to her. "I thought you might be hungry," he said with a gentle smile. Lily looked at the food, then at the stranger, uncertain whether she should accept such kindness. "I do not have enough money," she whispered softly. The man shook his head. "Today it is a gift, not a purchase." Lily hesitated only a second longer before quietly thanking him. She carefully broke the bread into 2 pieces, offering one half back to him. The traveler smiled with quiet surprise. "Even when you have very little, you still want to share." Lily lowered her eyes. "My mother always said food tastes better when no one eats alone." The words lingered in the afternoon air. The traveler accepted the small piece of bread, not because he needed it, but because he understood that refusing would diminish the kindness she wished to offer. They ate together beside the fountain, while people continued walking around them, barely noticing the simple moment unfolding in plain sight. After finishing the meal, the traveler asked whether she had family nearby. Lily gently hugged the worn cloth doll against her chest before quietly explaining that both of her parents had passed away months earlier and that she had been moving from one temporary shelter to another ever since. She admitted she tried not to cry because she did not want anyone to think she was weak, but sometimes the loneliness became too heavy for someone only 8 years old. The traveler listened without interrupting, his calm gray eyes filled with quiet understanding rather than pity. "You are not weak," he finally said. "Sometimes the bravest people are the ones who keep hoping after the world has given them every reason to stop." Lily looked at him with quiet curiosity. No one had spoken to her that way before. For the first time in many months, she felt as though someone truly saw her instead of merely noticing a lonely child sitting beside a fountain. The traveler gently adjusted the blanket resting across her shoulders after a cool breeze swept through the marketplace. Before Lily could ask his name, the peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the distant sound of horses approaching at a steady pace. People throughout the square immediately stopped their conversations and turned toward the northern entrance as a line of royal guards appeared beyond the crowded streets, searching every face with growing urgency, while the quiet traveler beside Lily slowly rose to his feet with an expression that suggested he had been expecting this moment all along. The sound of approaching horses grew louder with every passing second until the entire marketplace gradually fell silent. Merchants stopped arranging their goods, musicians lowered their instruments, and families instinctively stepped aside to clear a wide path through the crowded square. Lily Harper looked up with uncertainty as the traveler beside her remained perfectly calm, his steady gaze fixed on the approaching procession. Within moments, a line of royal guards rode into the marketplace, wearing polished silver armor that shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Their captain carefully surveyed every corner of the square before his eyes suddenly settled on the quiet traveler standing beside the little Omega girl. His expression immediately changed from concern to overwhelming relief. Without hesitation, he stepped down from his horse and walked forward with measured confidence. The entire marketplace watched in complete silence as he stopped only a few feet away from the traveler, placed one hand across his chest, and slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Every royal guard behind him mirrored the gesture at exactly the same moment. A wave of astonished whispers spread through the crowd as people struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Lily looked from the kneeling soldiers to the gentle stranger who had shared bread with her only minutes earlier. Confusion filled her blue eyes. She quietly tugged on the edge of his weathered cloak. "Why are they bowing to you?" she asked in an almost inaudible voice. The traveler looked down at her with the same reassuring smile that had comforted her beside the fountain. Before he could answer, the captain spoke with deep respect. "Your Majesty, the royal council has been searching for you throughout the kingdom since this morning." The words echoed across the square like a bell announcing an unforgettable moment. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Merchants who had barely noticed the traveler suddenly lowered their heads. Noble visitors stepped backward in disbelief. Parents who had hurried their children away from Lily only moments earlier stood speechless as the truth settled over the marketplace. The quiet stranger slowly removed the simple traveling cloak from his shoulders, revealing the elegant royal garments beneath. Although his appearance changed, his gentle expression remained exactly the same. He was Alpha King Ethan Montgomery, the most respected ruler in the kingdom. Lily instinctively took one small step backward, believing she had somehow made a terrible mistake by speaking to him so openly. Before fear could settle inside her heart, Ethan calmly knelt until they stood at the same eye level. "You have nothing to fear," he said softly. "You treated me exactly the way every person deserves to be treated, and I will always be grateful for that." Lily looked into his kind gray eyes and slowly realized that the gentle traveler had never truly disappeared. He had simply been a king wearing ordinary clothes. Ethan then rose to his feet and quietly extended his hand toward the little girl. Around them, the entire marketplace remained frozen, waiting to see what the Alpha King would do next. Lily hesitated for only a brief moment before placing her small hand into his, never imagining that one simple gesture would become the first step toward a future she had never dared to dream was possible. The warmth of the Alpha King's hand was steady and reassuring as Lily Harper looked up into his calm gray eyes, still struggling to believe that the kind traveler who had shared his bread with her was the ruler of the entire kingdom. Around them, the marketplace remained completely silent. No merchant called out to passing customers. No musician lifted an instrument, and even the restless horses stood quietly as though they understood the importance of the moment unfolding before them. Ethan Montgomery gently noticed Lily tightening her grip around the worn cloth doll she had carried everywhere since losing her parents. Without drawing attention to her nervousness, he carefully removed his royal cloak and wrapped it around her small shoulders once more. The rich fabric was far too large for the little girl, yet instead of making her appear smaller, it somehow made her seem protected for the first time in many months. Ethan slowly turned toward the gathered crowd, his expression remaining calm, but there was an unmistakable strength in his voice when he finally spoke. "Tell me," he said, allowing his words to reach every corner of the square. "How many of you walked past this child today?" No one answered. Faces that had once looked away from Lily now lowered toward the stone pavement. Parents held their children's hands a little tighter, while merchants quietly avoided meeting the king's eyes. Ethan did not raise his voice, nor did he speak with anger. His disappointment alone carried more weight than any shout ever could. This little girl did not ask for wealth, he continued. She did not ask for power. She did not even ask for comfort. She only hoped someone would stop long enough to remind her that she mattered. His words settled heavily over the crowd. Lily looked around with quiet confusion. She had grown so accustomed to being ignored that she had never imagined anyone would defend her in front of so many people. Ethan looked back at her and offered the same gentle smile she had first seen beside the fountain. "You should never have needed to earn compassion," he said softly. "Every child deserves it simply by existing." A young woman standing near the bakery quietly wiped tears from her eyes. The elderly baker who had wanted to help earlier lowered his head with regret, wishing he had followed his first instinct instead of allowing the moment to pass. Ethan then bent down until he was once again at Lily's eye level. "Would you allow me to walk beside you?" he asked. Lily blinked with surprise. "You want to walk beside me?" she whispered. Ethan nodded. "No, I would be honored." A faint smile, small and uncertain, slowly appeared across Lily's face. It was the first genuine smile anyone in the marketplace had seen from her all day. Without another word, Ethan gently lifted her into his arms, holding her with the same care a loving father would offer his own daughter. Lily instinctively rested one hand against his shoulder while still clutching her precious doll with the other. She felt safe enough to close her eyes for the first time in many weeks. As the Alpha King began walking toward the palace with the little Omega child resting peacefully against him, every person in the marketplace stepped aside, not because they were commanded to do so, but because they suddenly understood they were witnessing something far greater than royal authority. They were witnessing the quiet power of compassion changing the course of a single life forever. The journey from the marketplace to the royal palace was not long, yet for Lily Harper it felt like traveling into an entirely different world. Resting quietly in Alpha King Ethan Montgomery's arms, she watched the familiar streets pass by from a place where she finally felt safe instead of invisible. People standing along the road respectfully bowed as the royal procession moved forward, but many could not take their eyes off the little Omega girl wrapped inside the king's cloak. Their expressions were filled with confusion, curiosity, and quiet reflection. Ethan paid no attention to the whispers surrounding them. His focus remained on the child who had slowly relaxed against his shoulder after spending so many months carrying the weight of loneliness by herself. Every few moments he glanced down to make certain she was comfortable, adjusting the edge of the cloak whenever a cool breeze drifted through the streets. Lily looked up at the tall palace walls growing larger in the distance and spoke so softly that only Ethan could hear her. "Do I have to leave when we get there?" The question was so small, yet it carried the fear of a child who had already lost every place she had ever called home. Ethan answered without hesitation, "No one will send you away." Lily searched his face carefully, trying to decide whether such a promise could truly be believed. "People always leave," she whispered. Ethan gently smiled, his voice calm and steady. "Then allow me to be the first person who stays." Those words settled deep inside Lily's heart in a place that had almost forgotten how hope felt. As they approached the palace gates, rows of royal guards stood at attention while palace attendants gathered with surprised expressions. None of them had expected their king to return carrying a frightened little girl instead of leading discussions about trade or diplomacy. The massive iron gates slowly opened, revealing beautiful gardens filled with blooming roses, tall oak trees, and sparkling fountains that reflected the afternoon sunlight. Lily had never imagined such beauty existed. She quietly held her cloth doll a little closer, worried that she might somehow dirty the king's elegant clothing or the magnificent palace around them. Ethan noticed the concern in her eyes before she spoke a single word. "You belong wherever kindness welcomes you," he said gently. "Do not ever believe that beautiful places are only meant for powerful people." Palace servants respectfully stepped forward, offering blankets, warm tea, and fresh food, yet Ethan politely raised one hand. Slowly he said, "She has had enough surprises for one day." His voice carried the same quiet compassion that had first reached Lily beside the marketplace fountain. Instead of surrounding her with unfamiliar faces, He carefully carried her through the peaceful palace gardens where birds sang among flowering trees and the evening breeze carried the sweet scent of lavender. For the first time in many months, Lily found herself listening to silence that did not feel lonely. It felt comforting. She rested her head against Ethan's shoulder and looked toward the golden light stretching across the gardens. Somewhere deep inside, a frightened little girl who had spent far too long believing she did not belong anywhere began to imagine that perhaps home was not a place someone was born into. Perhaps home was simply the place where someone finally chose to keep their promise. As evening settled gently over the palace, warm golden light spilled through tall windows and painted soft patterns across polished marble floors. Yet Lily Harper remained close to Alpha King Ethan Montgomery, still uncertain whether this peaceful world could truly belong to her. Palace attendants prepared a simple supper, but Ethan asked that everything remain quiet and unhurried, understanding that trust could never be rushed into a frightened child's heart. While Lily carefully explored a comfortable sitting room filled with books, fresh flowers, and a crackling fireplace, Ethan met privately with the royal council and requested a complete report about the little girl's past. Within hours, trusted officials returned with carefully preserved records gathered from nearby villages. The truth was more heartbreaking than anyone had expected. Lily's father had been a respected schoolteacher known for treating every child with kindness regardless of rank, while her mother had served as a healer who never refused anyone seeking help. After illness claimed both of their lives within the same difficult season, neighbors had promised to care for their daughter, but those promises quietly disappeared as months passed. Families feared the responsibility of raising an omega child with no inheritance, and one after another, they chose convenience over compassion until Lily eventually found herself surviving alone with nothing except her mother's blanket and the cloth doll her father had given her on her 6th birthday. Ethan closed the report without speaking for several long moments. The silence inside the council chamber became heavier than any conversation. Finally, he looked toward his advisors with calm disappointment rather than anger. A kingdom should never measure the value of a child by what she owns or what title she carries, he said quietly. When we allow loneliness to become normal for even one innocent life, we all share responsibility. None of the council members argued because each understood the painful truth behind his words. Meanwhile, Lily wandered into the palace library, where shelves stretched almost to the ceiling. She had never seen so many books gathered in one place. She gently ran her fingertips along their colorful bindings without daring to remove any, afraid she might accidentally damage something too precious for someone like her to touch. Ethan entered the room a few minutes later and noticed the quiet wonder in her eyes. Instead of explaining royal traditions or expectations, he simply selected a beautifully illustrated storybook and placed it carefully into her hands. "This one was my favorite when I was young," he said with a warm smile. Lily looked at him with surprise. "Kings read stories like this?" Ethan softly laughed. "Before someone becomes a king, he is first a little boy who dreams about becoming a good man." Lily carefully opened the book, her eyes widening at the colorful pictures inside. For the first time since arriving at the palace, curiosity slowly replaced fear. Ethan sat beside her as they quietly turned the pages together, reading about courage, kindness, and hope beneath the warm glow of the fireplace. Watching the little girl smile as she discovered a world she had never been allowed to imagine, Ethan realized that protecting her meant far more than offering food or shelter. It meant giving her back the childhood that loneliness had tried to steal, one gentle moment, one shared story, and one kept promise at a time. The following morning, sunlight poured through the palace windows, filling every hallway with a gentle warmth that felt entirely different from the cold mornings Lily Harper had known outside. She woke in a quiet bedroom prepared especially for her, surrounded by soft blankets, clean clothes, and fresh flowers resting on the windowsill. For several moments, she simply sat on the edge of the bed, holding her old cloth doll in her lap, wondering whether the peaceful room would disappear like a pleasant dream the moment she opened the door. Instead, she found Alpha King Ethan Montgomery waiting in the hallway with the same calm smile he had offered her beside the marketplace fountain. "Good morning," he said warmly. "Would you like to have breakfast with me?" Lily nodded shyly, still surprised that the ruler of an entire kingdom continued speaking to her as though she were the only person in the room. During breakfast, Ethan encouraged her to choose whatever she wished from the table, but Lily carefully selected only a small piece of bread and a cup of warm milk. Ethan noticed her hesitation. "You do not have to save food for tomorrow anymore," he said gently. "There will always be enough here." Lily looked down at her plate before quietly whispering, "I am still learning how to believe that." Ethan understood those words carried months of uncertainty, so he did not rush her with reassurance. Instead, he simply remained beside her, allowing his actions to speak more loudly than promises. Later that afternoon, the royal council gathered in the Great Hall, expecting discussions about trade routes and harvest reports. Instead, Ethan entered with Lily walking quietly beside him, her small hand resting comfortably in his. The enormous chamber fell silent as nobles, advisors, and palace officials watched the little Omega girl standing beside the throne without fear. Ethan looked across the assembly before speaking in his calm, unwavering voice. "Yesterday this child believed she had no place in this kingdom. That belief was never her failure. It was ours." No one interrupted. Every eye remained fixed on the king. "From this day forward," he continued, "Lily Harper will live within these palace walls under my personal protection. She will receive an education, every opportunity to grow, and every kindness that should have been offered from the very beginning. Let every child in this kingdom understand that no title, no family name, and no circumstance will ever determine whether they deserve compassion." A quiet murmur of agreement spread throughout the hall before one council member slowly rose to his feet and respectfully bowed. Others followed one after another until the entire chamber stood united in support. Lily looked around with wide blue eyes, overwhelmed by the sight of so many people welcoming her instead of turning away. She gently looked up at Ethan, who simply smiled and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. For the first time since losing her parents, she no longer felt like someone waiting to be accepted. She felt seen, protected, and valued. As warm afternoon light streamed through the towering palace windows, the frightened little girl who had once cried alone beside a marketplace fountain quietly discovered that hope did not always arrive with great miracles. Sometimes it arrived through one gentle hand that refused to let go. 1 year passed, and the palace gardens had become Lily Harper's favorite place in the kingdom. Every morning, she could be found walking beneath the tall oak trees with a book tucked beneath one arm, and her old cloth doll still safely held in the other. Although she now wore elegant dresses prepared by the palace tailors, she had never asked anyone to replace the little doll that reminded her of her parents. It remained a treasured part of her story, not because it represented sorrow, but because it reminded her how far kindness had carried her. The frightened child who had once hidden beside a marketplace fountain now greeted palace attendants with cheerful smiles, spent afternoons studying with the finest teachers in the kingdom, and laughed freely with other children who visited the royal gardens. Yet the greatest change could not be measured by lessons learned or beautiful surroundings. It was found in the quiet confidence with which she looked at the world, no longer expecting every stranger to walk away. Ethan Montgomery often watched from a nearby garden path, while Lily chased butterflies across the green lawn or read beneath the flowering trees. He never saw himself as the hero of her story. In his heart, he believed he had simply done what every adult should have done the moment they saw a lonely child in need. One peaceful afternoon, they returned together to the same marketplace where their lives had first crossed. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. Merchants warmly welcomed Lily by name. Children invited her to join their games, and the elderly baker who had once hesitated stepped forward with a fresh loaf of bread, placing it gently into her hands with a grateful smile. "I should have stopped that day," he admitted quietly. Lily looked at him for a moment before breaking the loaf into 2 equal pieces, offering half back to him exactly as she had once done with the traveler she had not known was her king. "My mother always said food tastes better when no one eats alone," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan watched the exchange with quiet pride, realizing that compassion had a remarkable way of growing when someone first chose to share it. The people gathered throughout the marketplace witnessed not only a little girl who had found a home, but also a kingdom that had slowly begun remembering its own heart. As the afternoon sun painted the stone streets with warm golden light, Lily slipped her small hand into Ethan's once again. She no longer held on because she feared being left behind. She held on because she knew she belonged. Ethan looked down at the little girl who had become part of his family and smiled with quiet gratitude. He understood that crowns could guide kingdoms and laws could protect nations, but neither possessed the power to change a life as completely as one simple decision to stop, to listen, and to care. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, another lonely child might one day hear the story of the Alpha King who paused beside a crying little girl when everyone else kept walking, discovering that true strength was never measured by power alone, but by the courage to choose kindness when kindness was needed most.